All right, so why don't we start the last video of the semester. This one is going to be a little bit longer. It'll be the full length just because I don't see like a real natural breaking up point for this one. So it might end up being a little bit longer than the usual 50 minutes, but we'll see how it goes. Um, Before I start, I do just want to mention too, I'll email more about this, and I've said it a few times already, but I do really appreciate how flexible everybody has been with the changes, and I hope that I've been flexible enough with everybody, and that the experience of having to change this at the end of the semester has been tolerable. No, it wasn't ideal, and I hope everybody is staying safe and doing well. As the last week and a half before the final elapses, I just want to make sure everybody knows they can contact me with questions. If you don't feel like your question can be answered in an email, I'm happy to Zoom with anybody, but yeah, just let me know what I can do to help everybody prepare and be ready for the final. Okay, so again, our last topic, one that I wish we had a little more time for, but I think we can pack a lot of interesting information into this last presentation, is applied social psychology. And this is a topic that we have touched on here and there throughout the semester, but I want to make sure that we're talking specifically about how we can use some of the knowledge from social psych to influence the real world. First, a distinction that I made in one of our very first lectures that I want to come back to is just what applied psychology or applied research of any kind really is. Remember that basic research is something that is concerned with advancing theory, so testing new hypotheses just for the sake of knowledge accumulation and refining and advancing testing theories. Applied psychology is when you're using that information to actually do something in the real world, like change a policy to improve people's lives, or try to develop a therapy to be implemented in a particular demographic, or do anything basically to make people's lives better or easier or less problematic in some way, shape, or form. There used to be more of a stigma around applied research that it was, if you can't advance theories, then, you go take somebody else's theories and try to change something in the world. But anymore, that has, started changing in the right direction, that we're recognizing that actually applying knowledge to the real world can be very hard and necessary in its own right. Because, for a lot of people, that's kind of the goal, right? That we can do something with this knowledge that we're accumulating. We're not just accumulating it just for, as some might see it, no reason. We're doing it so we can actually improve things. So social psych, applied social psych rather, is actually using the stuff that we've talked about this semester to really bring about some kind of social change in a positive direction. Not just trying to understand a type of social problem or phenomenon, but actually trying to fix it or improve it or mitigate it in some way. So we're both trying to understand social and real world practical problems, but also trying to develop some sort of strategy or policy or intervention to improve the circumstances around them. And I, hope in the course of the semester, like I mentioned, we've talked about this stuff a little bit. I hope you've kind of noticed some of these examples and gotten excited about them, because we really do know a lot about how we can improve people's lives from some of the stuff we've talked about in class, that we can improve the attitudes and behaviors between groups that previously were engaged in hostile sorts of conflict. We can make people more conscious about the environment and lead them towards strategies that might be good for conservation and reducing the damage that we're doing to the planet, making people less likely to engage in aggressive behavior, making people more likely to start volunteering and sustain volunteering and focus those efforts towards things that will actually help, and trying to get people to help in emergencies. These are just a few things that we've talked about that, some of the examples we use in class would fit under the rubric of applied social psychology. One extremely important thing about applied social psych or any applied science is that you are not just, taking the lessons from studies and assuming that they will work in the real world. There needs to be more rigorous, systematic evaluation of programs before you just kind of throw them out into the world. And, you might think, what harm can it do to just use social psych ideas to try to influence people's behavior? But as kind of a counterexample, think about other areas where you would be skeptical to undergo something if there was not good research around it. So, new areas of medicine, like if you had an ailment and you needed a particular medication, would you feel comfortable taking a medication that hadn't been tested at all? I mean, probably not. You'd have a lot of reservations about the side effects, about its effectiveness, and what if it had terrible side effects and it didn't even mitigate or it didn't even improve the ailment you were suffering from? Or, something like having an experimental surgery. Would you let somebody cut you open if they weren't really sure that the surgery they were going to do was actually going to help you? Probably not, right? So just like in these types of domains that can have real impacts on people's lives, social psych interventions should be tested just as rigorously. We should go through a vetting process before we introduce any sort of intervention or change or policy based on social psych to know that it's going to work or have some level of confidence that it's going to work and that it doesn't lead to unforeseen risks or complications down the line. Unfortunately, this doesn't tend to be the case. This is not just a problem for social psych. This is a problem for scientific application very broadly, that people are impatient, people are overconfident, people often are not testing things well enough, particularly in areas where there are not sufficient regulations. So around medicine, for example, there tend to be more regulations. You can't just rush a drug to market, although if you call your drug a supplement, you can do whatever the hell you want, and you can just make vague claims, and you can completely get around the FDA and things like that. But yeah, that's a rant for another day, I guess. But if we're taking a medicine, you can be relatively confident that that's gone through some sort of trials that have vetted it. But for other areas like social psych and things like that, you might have a little more reason to be skeptical that those things have been safely tested. So, what are some types of areas where we might want to introduce things but make sure that they are being tested well enough? Some things that I've kind of already mentioned, sustainability. You might have interventions to try to reduce the impact we have on the planet, but you might also have reasonable concerns about, if we're trying to conserve water in one way, is it leading to some sort of negative outcome in another area, like we're using some other resource more or something like that. Just improving people's general quality of life, or being more goal-oriented, or improving their relationships. You might have interventions aimed towards these things, but a lot of times the interventions around these areas might not work as well as you might think, just from hoping that something's going to work out, like all the different apps that are out there to help you with your confidence and your time management, or different groups that are not based on sound therapy that might purport to help your relationships or make you a more effective worker or something. Like, there are lots of these types of things that are not tested very rigorously. Health, unfortunately, I mentioned how a lot of medicines and therapies are rigorously tested, but that's often not the case for things based on social science research. That you might find that a lot of assumptions are being made in these areas, but there are lots of very dedicated researchers in social psych and other social science areas that look at health and are trying to right these wrongs and look at how stress can influence health, and how we can have better health outcomes by reducing stress and things like that, how social support can help a great deal. And we're going to come back to those as big examples later in this presentation. Okay, sorry, I paused it because I was suddenly worried that the mic was not recording, but it is. Anyway, last one that, it hits a little closer to my research area are things like how effective or how confident we can be in the types of legal processes that are going on, like how juries make decisions and how eyewitness testimony is used. We know that sometimes these things are not reliable. Juries might come to bad, polarized decisions because of stuff we talked about in group processes, and eyewitness testimony might be false because people are overconfident and their memories are bad. But you wouldn't want to just try to change these things without testing a way of improving them first in a very controlled way, or you could lead to even worse outcomes accidentally. Like if you changed how eyewitness lineups are conducted and you thought you were making them more reliable, it's possible you could be wrong and you could actually make them less reliable and lead to even worse outcomes than our criminal justice system already has. So you need to be able to test these things to have confidence that you're actually helping people. I think just by talking about some of those things, hopefully you're seeing some of the themes that we've talked about this semester coming up in all of those different areas. And I think talking about applied social psych makes it obvious how much you have to consider when you're thinking about any intervention, and how all these areas that we've talked about this semester are really tied together. So just as an example that is maybe unsurprisingly the one I'm most interested in, the prejudice research that I've done, and many other more accomplished people that we've talked about this semester have done. This brings a lot of research areas in. So when you talk about prejudice, it's not just its own separate research area, but you're thinking about things from self and identity and aggression and pro-social behavior and conformity, attraction, group processes, social cognition, basic things about social perception. So if we just dove in and started talking about prejudice, it would take 3 times as long because we wouldn't have all of these more basic contributing sorts of processes and that background information. So I hope this semester you've kind of seen how connected things are, and not only should that give you an idea of how complex human behavior is, but it should give you an idea of how difficult it is to actually fully understand, or even close to fully understand, a phenomenon, and how important it would be to test things rather than just assume you know how things are going to work. Health psychology is a very hot area of applied psych because it's something that hits a lot of people very close to home, and it's something that we might not always see as being as important as it actually is, because there really is a complex relationship between our physical, medical health and our psychological or mental health. And we think about one pathway here, and it is a little bit more obvious and it might come to mind more, that your physical health can impact your psychological health. That if you're distracted by pain or you're having ongoing problems, that can be stressful and taxing and demanding and diminish your psychological health. Or if you see an improvement in physical health, that might bolster your psychological or mental health. But one area we don't think about quite as much necessarily might be how our psychological health impacts our physical health. That if you have high levels of stress, that you're going to see deterioration in your physical health. So, I mean, again, this is one we'll come back to a few times in this presentation, but it is, I think, a very evocative example of how closely tied together these things tend to be, and how much we need to think about how different variables might feed back on each other and influence each other. Just to give you one idea of how important these types of psychological factors are on physical health, one quick study to mention is a kind of old longitudinal study where they just had 2 measurement periods, where they looked at people's views on aging in 1975, where they measured this. And it was, a scale of things about how people felt about getting older. For example, as you get older, you get less useful. So it would be a negative attitude about aging, and they measured, positive and negative attitudes both directions, and had a whole variety of ways they asked these questions. Then they looked at people's health later on. So 23 years later, they measured health. And a very straightforward way that epidemiologists and health researchers measure health that is a little bit morbid and certainly oversimplified is just by measuring, are people alive or not, or how long did they live. And there are a lot of other things that contribute to whether somebody is alive and how long they live, but it's still a very important indicator of health, right? So if our psychological processes don't really impact our physical health, we might not expect there to be a relationship here, but they did observe a very large difference between the people that had a negative view of aging, who tended to live 15 years on average from this measurement period, to people that had a positive view of aging that tended to live, over 50% longer. They lived 22 years compared to 15 years if they had a more positive view of aging. So I know there are a lot of other things that could contribute to that. Maybe the people that had negative views of aging had, negative health outcomes and had chronic issues that were, their negative views might be related to an illness or a problem that could lead to their death. But even controlling for these differences, there were enormous effects of these positive views on survival generally. So there does seem to be a pretty stark connection there. So if we want to think about ways to apply psychological science to things like health in other areas, how do we develop interventions that actually work? So I'm going to talk about a few different tenets that we should kind of stick by if we want to develop things like this. The first of which is that effective interventions are not just based on intuition, they're based on established theory. So it's not just assumptions that you have about how variables are related, it's by using long-standing developed research traditions and trying to make sure that that you're basing your interventions on these prior findings. So it's not your gut feelings, it's things that you're actually drawing from well-developed ideas. One example of this, of just like using assumptions rather than theory, is how we often think about, attitude change or how people might, move away from a dangerous activity. We think a good way to do that frequently is fear. That if you scare somebody away or scare somebody about the consequences of something, that it might help diminish their interest in it. So things like Scared Straight programs, which, if you don't know, is a popular documentary in the 1980s, and a program that went on after that where they'd bring at-risk youth, usually young inner-city boys, to prisons and quote-unquote scare them straight. They would have a bunch of big, scary prisoners scream at them and tell them how much they were screwing up their lives and how terrible prison was, and then that was supposedly going to turn their lives around. And lo and behold, that didn't work, just to scare the crap out of kids. If anything, it actually made them feel as though they were doomed to these sorts of outcomes. Another example is how we often look at, drug abuse strategies to keep kids from starting and continuing to do drugs, like trying to scare people about consequences. Well, it often can be kind of cartoonish and silly, and people might not take it seriously if you're talking about the evils of the devil's lettuce or whatever silly thing you come up with about a particular drug. So included in this is, if you actually look at research on how fear impacts attitude change, there is a relationship that suggests that if you increase fear, attitude change is going to also increase. But there's a point of diminishing returns there, where you can scare people a bit and it might motivate them to change their behavior or change their attitudes. But if you scare people too much, like in Scared Straight, or telling people, hey, cigarettes are going to kill you, and that's the only information you give them, that can be kind of paralyzing to people, where they think that, it's a foregone conclusion that things are going to go poorly for them. So you can't just scare people unendingly. You need to kind of modulate how much you're scaring them and give them strategies for how to change rather than just freaking them out. So the assumption that fear works would be an idea that would actually lead to more harm than good in a lot of cases, and you need to test things to find out how much fear actually is going to work to help there. Interventions also are usually relatively intense in size and scope. What I mean by that is they're not, just reading a paragraph or going to a single information session. They usually have a lot more to them if they're going to have large and lasting change. So interventions that last longer, like more sessions, more exposures, more trainings, whatever, are going to lead to longer, sustained, lasting change. If you have shorter interventions, you can expect your effects to wear off relatively quickly. If you have more intense interventions also, you're going to see larger changes. If you have kind of a weak intervention, like, you're just giving people a little bit of information, then, maybe they'll change their behavior a bit, or their health will improve a bit, but it's probably not going to be that big of a difference. So, sometimes you hear people say less is more, and that doesn't tend to be the case with interventions based on social psych. That more is usually more. And that's not always going to be true for every single case, but in the sense of intensity and or intensity of size and scope, more is usually better. One example of this is a study that was trying to improve heart disease rates and deaths in areas around Stanford. So they were looking at different cities in California that were kind of matched on size and demographics and things like that. And they used a lot of different ways of doing this. They used mass media appeals to tell people about things that contributed to heart disease. They were trying to change how people ate, get them to exercise, and get them to stop smoking. And they, compared 2 cities where they did a lot of intense interventions to 3 cities where they didn't do anything. And they did this over 6 years, not 6 days or 6 weeks or 6 months. They did this over 6 years to try to influence people's behavior. So to get people to do all these big things like change how they eat, change how they move and act, and change whether they smoke, that's not going to be a quick thing you can do. So by using mass media appeals, giving educational seminars in schools and public places, and changing things about policy, they were able to, over this 6-year period, drastically reduce the people's cholesterol, blood pressure, heart rate, smoking rate, which all led to decreased deaths from and cases of heart disease. So these things take time and intentionality to do something well, but they tend to be very worthwhile. Another kind of example of maybe what not to do, I guess, in this regard, is something that I don't think most, if any of you, are probably old enough or in an area that did this. I could be wrong, however. But if you're not familiar with this program, there's something called Drug Abuse Resistance Education, or DARE, which is like a classroom intervention that was developed in the mid-1980s to get kids to keep them from starting and doing drugs, to keep them from joining gangs and stuff like that. And it makes sense on its face. It's a program where police officers come into classrooms. Um, it started out in the later parts of elementary school, and people thought it was pretty successful. So it was expanded to many K through 12 schools, and this was it wasn't all school districts. School districts like opted into it, but they had tons of funding, and it was in hundreds of school districts across the country, from federal and private funding. And they bring uniformed police officers into classrooms, once a week or something, to talk to kids about drugs and like role play peer pressure activities and stuff like that to show kids how not to use drugs. And they also, in the course of this, they also talked about drugs a whole lot. And DARE was never something that was empirically tested before they implemented it. They just said, hey, it would probably help for kids to find out things about drugs, so let's tell them lots of stuff about drugs so they can be prepared for when they're faced with it. And then, if they are trained to resist peer pressure, that'll work. And no one did anything to figure out if that was true. And lots of different studies over the intervening years, starting in the mid-90s, about 10 years after it started, and then up to the mid to late 2000s when they sort of stopped DARE as it was originally conceived, showed that it was really ineffective. If you do randomly assigned groups from different school districts, and look at people's drug use 1 year after DARE up to 10 years after, it did not reduce the use of literally any drug. So they're focused on cigarettes, alcohol, and other drugs, and other drugs has a wide variety in there, and it did not have any efficacy for any of these drugs. And in actuality, many of these studies showed that it increased drug use and the amount of, or the number of kids that were trying drugs in their school-aged years. Presumably because kids that took DARE were learning about drugs that they would not have ever known existed if they had not taken it. Or they're learning about, for example, what marijuana is years before they otherwise would have learned about it. So they didn't think about this, that they're introducing kids to all this knowledge about drugs, and that is going to entice some of the kids to want to try drugs. So DARE actually is a complete backfire of a program. In the very best case, it is completely ineffective, and in the more likely case that we see from lots of evidence, it actually led to more drug use in these different communities. So this is why I bring this one up, that it's not just good enough that you have an intense intervention. Like 17 weeks, that kind of seems like a lot, right? You're doing things in schools, you have outreach in communities, you're putting up signs about DARE communities, you're changing policy based on these recommendations, and it didn't work at all. It was a total waste of money and led to more people smoking, drinking, and doing drugs at earlier ages. So you need to test these things, not just assume that having something that's intense is going to work. And I got to share my absolute favorite thing about DARE, which is not as influential as some of the other things about why kids seem to be doing drugs earlier, but this just is an example of how poor their planning process was. They gave out lots and lots of merchandise. That was like it was free. They weren't like selling it or anything, but that was one of the main reasons people seem to kind of like DARE, that they got, it was the 80s and 90s, they were getting neon colored pens and rulers and junk that look cool and are cool to the 90s people like myself at the time. I was a DARE student, by the way, and they gave out all this merch, and they didn't really plan it out, and this is indicative of their lack of planning in general. That this was an example of a pencil they gave out. This obviously is just a an example so you can see the problem with it. But this was real. This is not a real picture of it, but these pencils were made that they wrote "too cool to do drugs" on them. But as you sharpen them, it would say "cool to do drugs," and then eventually "do drugs." So not a lot of foresight here. If they even would have reversed it, and had the eraser on the other side, then it wouldn't have had this like really goofy, funny outcome. So dare, not one of the better interventions out there. One other thing, or another thing that tends to be very important for making effective interventions is having your target group having your intervention tailored to that group. So, sometimes things can seem really out of touch. If you're older people tailoring an intervention for younger people, oftentimes it can seem like condescending, or you're not using the right kind of language to relate to people. And so, between age groups, this is a problem. Between different like racial and ethnic groups, this can be a big problem. Like, a bunch of white people trying to do like a get out the vote intervention for like a Latinx community, like, they're maybe not going to be able to understand the right types of things they need to say because they're not part of the community. So there need to be considerations and buy-in from the people that are supposed to be reached in order to get appropriate interventions. One successful example of this is still around, but I think it was really more popular and visible in the mid-2000s. Is an anti-smoking campaign called Truth, stylized, like not capitalized and with a period at the end like that. They were doing a lot of like some of the early sort of viral sort of content where they were basically trying to show kids and teens that cigarette companies are out to use you up and move on to the next people, basically. And they would do things like one of their famous ads, they had hundreds of people get into body bags outside of the office building of a big tobacco company and just lie there and block the streets and made a scene, and it was a big very visible thing to show that tobacco companies are they don't care about you, and they you're eventually going to die, and that's built into their calculations of how to make money. And that's something that to rebel against. It's not cool to rebel to smoke cigarettes. You should be rebelling against the tobacco companies, was their sort of message. So they would do things like that. They would reveal internal types of memos from tobacco companies that said things like, we need to get kids hooked on cigarettes because the older smokers are going to die, and we need to hook children and younger adults to get them to sustain our business model, basically. So this campaign, after a couple of years in the mid to late 2000s, you looked at smoking levels. This is in I think these are national levels, but if you looked at the smoking levels in these demographics, they dropped precipitously because these ads were everywhere. They were on TV. There were tons of billboards and bus stop ads and bench ads and stuff. They played them before movies very frequently. So these things were intense. They were going on for a long time, but more importantly, they were very tailored to the target market of like 18 to 24-year-olds that, you should not be smoking for X, Y, and Z reasons. But it was, should have mentioned this earlier too, it was very much run by people in that age group. Like, of course, they had other people in older age groups doing some of the like behind the scenes type of work, but many of the protests and lots of the marketing were developed by younger people. So tailoring their sorts of appeals to the right sort of age group, basically. So if you look at, not just these big national level smoking rates, if you look at areas where these ads were frequently versus less frequently shown, they weren't randomly assigning people to these, it was just where they could buy the ads. So it's not an experiment, but it's still lots of information. And lots and lots of different evaluations of this, the more your particular town had these ads, the less smoking there would have been. So these were expensive, like good interventions can frequently be very expensive to have all these different modalities of putting the message out there. But look, I mean, it just about cut smoking in half in those demographics, which is unbelievable, especially after 2 years. One of the most effective public health campaigns in history. And again, sorry, high cost, very, very expensive. And the only reason they were able to do it is because tobacco companies have already, lost several big federal and class action type lawsuits, and part of their settlements were to pay for, people working against them, basically. So this isn't something that you can do all the time, and it just shows you how difficult it is to do something this effective. Very, very expensive. Another one, an example of not tailoring your message effectively to your target group. If you look at things like an abstinence-only sex ed program, that's, to a target group of teenagers and young adults who, are understandably interested in having sex. Just telling them that, the only way to be healthy and pure and not have a kid is to not have sex at all, it's not going to be terribly effective, because that's like the opposite of what many, many people at that age group are interested in, right? So there are lots and lots of sex ed programs, privately and publicly in different states, that only teach abstinence. They don't mention any type of birth control or anything like that. And they, they come from sometimes a religious place, sometimes just kind of a general puritanical type of place. But, they are using values instead of looking at how things might be more effective in keeping people safe and keeping unwanted pregnancies from happening. So a lot of times these abstinence things, they include people making some kind of pledge, like either in front of people out loud, or like writing something down at your school or church or whatever it happens to be that says you're not going to have sex until marriage. So these people provide kind of a convenient comparison. The people that take the pledge compared to the people that don't take the pledge, are there any differences? And if you look 5 years later from when people are doing this in their, teenage years, there tend to be no differences whatsoever on if they have sex, how old they are when they first have sex, how many STIs they get, or the rates of them, the frequency of oral or anal sex. So it's not even affecting like the types of sexual activities they're engaged in, or the number of partners. So it's not doing anything on any of these differences. So these pledges are not changing anything about the actual behavior of people, except in one domain. The only thing that's different for the people that take these abstinence pledges versus other ones, versus not taking them rather, is that the people that take abstinence pledges aren't using birth control. So they're undermining pretty much the only goal they have is to, I guess a big goal for a lot of people that institute these things is that they just don't want people to have sex in general. But the stated goal is that they want people to be safe and avoid unwanted pregnancy. Well, if people are having the same rates of sex and they're just not using birth control, then those people are way more likely to get sick and way more likely to have unwanted children. So it actually is incredibly counterproductive to have abstinence-only sex ed programs. Unspeakably counterproductive. I don't know. It's baffling to me that these things are still going on, but values frequently can trump evidence, unfortunately. Oh, and people that take the pledge, I forgot about this, sorry, generally don't even remember that they did it. So the vast majority of people that take these pledges that, it is making some, you know, older person that wants this to happen happy to see that they have this stack of pledges that says a bunch of teenagers aren't going to have sex, but the teenagers aren't even paying attention. They're generally not even remembering the pledge. They're just not going to use condoms anymore, basically. So nice work, abstinence program people. Okay, just another way to underlie how complicated the mechanisms of action for things can be and how many different ways you might want to try to target your interventions is something you may have heard of before called the biopsychosocial perspective or biopsychosocial model. It's basically just saying that a lot of different things contribute to health. Our biology in general, both like your individual genes and just the way human bodies work in general, your psychology, the mental processes and attitudes, and the social world. All these things interact to lead to health outcomes. One example might be, interventions that have to do with dieting, leading to weight regain. So if you lose weight on a diet, are you going to gain it back? Well, this isn't an easy question to answer, right? It has a lot to do with different, complicated outcomes. That there's all sorts of biological things going on with your metabolism changing and lots of different, digestive and metabolic things that I'm not going to pretend that I am an expert in. But there are biological determinants of this. There are psychological determinants of this, that you are going to be in a worse mood. You are going to feel bad if you violate your diet, and then maybe binge after that. You're going to feel cognitively loaded. So eating might occur because of these things, but it's not just these things separately. It's that these things can interact with your social world as well. And stress can be a big factor there that leads to weight regain. So just thinking about one of these things separately is not going to give you a complete picture of how these things work. So trying to tailor your interventions to all the possible mechanisms, or testing which mechanism is the most important and tailoring your intervention to that can be really useful. Okay, so speaking of stress, like we saw in the middle there, that stress is a big determinant of if you're going to gain weight back. I want to turn to talking about some things that have to do with health and stress to sort of wrap up our applied psych lessons here. So stress, you have a lay understanding certainly of what it is. From a psychological perspective, we could define it as a negative emotional experience accompanied by predictable biochemical, physiological, cognitive, and behavioral changes that are directed either toward altering the stressful event or accommodating to its effects. So running away from something that's scary, or turning off the TV when it's a news story that's bothering you, or changing your behavior to suit some stressful situation, right? But there are lots of different kinds of stress too, and different kinds of stressors. Stressors being things that cause stress. So physical and psychological stressors are kind of the two classes here. Physical ones tend to be things that any sort of creature or animal, whether human or otherwise, might find stressful. So physical things like hunger, cold, pain, fatigue, physical threats like predators. Contrast these with psychological sources of stress. Basically things that human beings are going to find stressful only. So, squirrels don't worry about grades. Elephants don't really have a concern about job security, et cetera, et cetera. Humans are the ones worrying about money, traffic, all these sort of abstract concepts that we bring to mind. So, one distinction you might make here is that these physical stressors tend to be things that are maybe more ancient and more natural types of stressors, things that have always been around in human history. Psychological stressors might be things that are more likely to be modern inventions. So things that we are perhaps not as adapted to. They're no less real, like getting a grade that is lower than you expect, or anticipating a poorer outcome or something. That's stressful. Worrying about losing your job is stressful. Worrying about not having enough money to buy food and support your family is stressful. There's no way around that. So these things are not less real than physical stressors, but they are modern, not modern inventions, but modern, I can't think of the word. They're in the modern age compared to these things that have always been around for humans in their evolutionary history. Another way to distinguish stressors is whether they are acute or chronic. What I mean by this is acute are sudden stressors that you have to deal with immediately. So things that are causing you physical pain, physical threats, if you're starving, if you got stabbed, if you are extremely cold or hot or something. These are acute stressors that you need to deal with right away. Most physical stressors are acute, but not necessarily all physical stressors are acute. And there are, some psychological stressors that are acute too that you want to deal with immediately. So highly correlated between acute and physical, but not completely related. Chronic stressors are, of course, the opposite. They're ones that are lasting longer, things you worry about over time. If you're worried about your job security, that's not something that you're worried about for 5 minutes on a Wednesday morning. It's something that you are worried about for days and weeks and months and possibly years at a time. Or financial hardships are things that are going to bother people for an extended period of time, not just I'm hungry, can I get some food? It's, am I going to be able to feed myself and my family? Very different ways or very different sources of stress. So again, frequently physical stressors are acute and psychological stressors are chronic. And this is, again, another way to think about how these are sort of different across our evolutionary history. That acute physical stressors are the things that we tended to have in our ancestral environment. Remember when we were living in smaller bands of people and we never traveled very far from home, and our main concern was having food and shelter, right? That predators were acute physical stressors. A flood or not having a roof in the rain or something was an acute physical stressor that human beings had to deal with for the vast majority of their evolutionary history. So we are adapted in a very literal evolutionary sense to dealing with acute physical stressors. Chronic psychological stressors are much newer. They're only a few thousand years old, and human beings have not adapted to any things that are that new in our environment. So chronic psychological stressors are still very real, and they still cause real stress responses, but they are not things that we have evolved to. So the responses that we have to stress are all really appropriate reactions to acute physical stressors, not chronic psychological type stressors. So what does stress do to your body? What do these reactions that we have do physically to us? Well, because most of those acute physical stressors, because acute physical stressors were the ones that we are adapted to, our body does things that are appropriate in the context of those physical stressors. That if you needed to escape from something, or you needed to build something, or help somebody, you would get energy. You'd get things like adrenaline, for example, and other kind of stimulant hormones that we have in our bodies, and physiological messages that blunt pain, for example. If you hurt yourself and you needed to continue on or something, you're not going to feel that ankle hurting, and you're going to be able to escape from danger. So these are very, obviously related to that. Other ones maybe a little bit less so, that these other ones are associated with a sympathetic nervous response, that you're going to mobilize energy in these ways specifically, that you're going to divert energy toward immediate sources and being able to engage in that fight or flight and run or protect yourself in some way, and slow down these things that are not necessary in your immediate circumstances. So slowing digestion, growth, and reproduction, because you don't need it to escape from a bear, right? You don't need the food in your stomach or to get bigger or to have offspring if you're going to die in the next 5 minutes. You need to use that energy to survive that acute physical stressor there. Unfortunately, all of these things that we have as our stress response lead to negative physiological outcomes. That if you are constantly being stressed out and having higher blood pressure and heart rate, you're going to be more likely to get a heart disease and strokes. If your digestion is slowing down, you're going to get ulcers, colitis, and you're going to have bowel problems. If you are stressed a lot early in life especially, you might have long-term growth problems and have dwarfism from stress. If you are stressed all the time, that's going to divert resources away from your reproduction. You might not be interested in sex, you might not be able to have sex, you might miscarry, you might not ovulate. You might, have these negative outcomes in that regard. Blunting pain, generally good in like the acute physical sense, because you might escape because you're not distracted by the cut on your arm. But if you're ignoring your pain, then you might actually make it worse. I'll talk about this in a minute, but aging can happen a lot faster because of the wear in general that stress has on your body in all these different ways. And this one, kind of goes without saying, or without explanation. I mean, if your immune system is being suppressed because you're diverting energy towards surviving in the moment, you are obviously susceptible to lots of other sorts of physical and medical problems. So stress is an adaptive response so we can overcome immediate threats. But when it is happening a lot because of our chronic psychological stressors, we're having these same types of responses that are adapted to immediate action, but we're feeling them all the time. So if you're worried about losing your job, or you're worried about graduating, or you're worried about if you're going to have food for your family, then you still are experiencing these things. Your digestion, growth, reproduction are all slowed down. Your immune system is not working as well. You're aging faster because of these things that we are not adapted to deal with. So this is probably the biggest, most influential way that our suite of physiological responses that are very well adapted to a particular environment are not adapted to the modern environment and lead to lots of problems. So I said I was going to talk about aging a little bit. This would be the point where I ask people if anybody knows what these things are, and probably one or two people would raise their hands and say, those are aglets. And they would be right. Aglets are just the little things, whether they're plastic or metal caps on the end of a shoelace to keep shoelaces from unraveling. So aglets are kind of a useful metaphor for something that happens to us genetically. So these are representations of chromosomes. These are how our DNA is stored and expressed within a cell. So these are just kind of bundles of double helix DNA, like very tightly wound, our genetic programming that tells our body what to do and when to do it and what to look like and all those good things. At the end of our chromosomes, we have basically aglets. These things are called telomeres. Actually, I think it might be telomerase. I've heard people say that, and I think it's wrong, but I honestly am not 100% sure. So don't quote me on which one it is, but I believe it's supposed to be like a plural, like telomeres. But I mean, I bet there are like 30 of you that know if I'm right or wrong and are just laughing at me right now. But anyway, I'm going to keep saying telomeres. At the end of our chromosomes, we have these things that keep them from unraveling, basically. So if your telomeres are longer, then that indicates you are very literally younger. And the older you get, the more they kind of unravel or shorten. And they mark aging naturally, like the older you are, the shorter they're going to be, but they also can cause physiological aging if they become shortened. And they seem to become shortened, unfortunately, due to stress. So, for example, there's a study where they look at mothers that have chronically ill children and how long they've had to care for these chronically ill children, something that is, I can only imagine, an incredibly stressful thing to deal with. You know, it's not maybe the strongest relationship in the world, but, you know, 20% of the variance explained is pretty big for a kind of biological effect like this. That the longer these people had to deal with all of the stress and issues with caring for a chronically ill child, the shorter their telomeres tended to be. You know, these are, I know this study is like 15 years old at this point, but this is, you know, still kind of a contested point whether this is completely true or not, right? We need more research in this area, but it does seem to suggest that this has something to do with our with the stress leads to changes in telomeres. So stress doesn't only affect us genetically and affect our aging, it can affect us in a lot of other different ways. It might even actually very literally shrink our brains. It seems that although stress hormones like cortisol are helpful in little doses to, you know, give you energy or help you focus, if you have it all the time, then it can have a problem with not just brain development, but like an already developed brain. So there is a study that has looked at comparing people that have PTSD to not having PTSD from their experiences in combat, as well as how long they were exposed to combat. So obviously it's a very small sample size, but the people that had more combat exposure seem to have much smaller hippocampuses than people that had shorter combat exposure. So all the stress that would come from all the, you know, unimaginable things you'd experience in being deployed for combat, you know, seems to actually shrink the size of that very important structure that has a lot to do with memory formation. So it can actually shrink at least, you know, I have kind of a clickbaity thing up here, but it can at least shrink parts of your brain, we think. And stress can do all kinds of other terrible things to us too, and it can suppress our immune system, probably something a lot of you already know. One way that this has been studied is by these things that they tend to call like cold or flu hotels, or motels, I guess. They're these research studies that, you know, they're probably not doing right now, but ways that people tend to study the common cold, where you volunteer for a study where you might get infected with or exposed to a common cold. They want to see how it spreads and what sort of symptoms happen. So you go to like a laboratory or sometimes like a literal hotel that researchers have rented out or part of one. You complete all kinds of questionnaires about your aspects of your life and stress and things like that, and then you're randomly assigned to either get exposed to a cold virus or to a placebo, something that does not have a cold virus, of course. Then they measure the progression of your cold symptoms, and in some of these studies they want to see, does stress make it more likely you're going to catch a cold, and does it make the symptoms more extreme? So in one of these studies, they looked at, you know, how likely it was people were going to get a cold based on their levels of stress. So they used people that had no stress as the baseline. So the relative risk of getting a cold, if you're comparing people that have no stress, it's a 1-to-1 comparison. You might say that they're equally likely as somebody else who doesn't have a stressor. But if you had a significant life stressor that had been going on for less than a month, then that already raised your rate to a 1.65, I believe, relative risk. So you're 65% more likely to get a cold just if you are experiencing a stressor, like starting to go through a divorce, or you have a loved one who is terminally ill, or you're going to lose your job, or the definition is kind of broad. And if that has been lasting up to 6 months, then your rate doubles. Up to 2 years, your rate almost triples. And if you've had a significant stressor going on for 2 years at the time of a study like this, your rate is 4 times that of a person without a stressor. So, I think it's just striking how linear this relationship is, and how it just keeps going up and up. These stress effects are additive, that your immune system just keeps working worse and worse the more and longer you are stressed out. So all this stuff together, our stress response in general, it's a good thing. It's necessary. It is something that is adaptive in the sense that we survived as a species because we had the stress response, and we were able to mobilize energy in a way that helped us escape from acute physical dangers and stressors like predators and natural disasters and things like that. So if we didn't have our stress response, we would not have survived as a species as well as we have, or we would have had to adapt in a different way. But our current environment in the modern day, where we have these chronic psychological stressors that we are not used to in the long-term evolutionary sense, if we're constantly feeling stress because of these things and the responses are not suited to it, we have these problems, like our immune system's going down and aging prematurely, and brain shrinking. So stress is an incredibly impactful factor in our lives. But there are some things we can do to combat it. So there are important things like learning how to engage in problem-focused coping, so dealing with your problems head-on in a focused way. I know it's not always the easiest thing in the world, but there are therapeutic strategies and trainings that you can engage in to learn how to do this. Reappraisal would be, thinking about what those stressors are, and thinking about your response to them, and thinking about how it might motivate you and what it actually means in terms of emotions. Emotion-focused coping, doing things to try to relax and reduce that stress response by engaging with it and actively trying to lessen its impacts. The one I'll talk about more, because it's so much more relevant for this class, of course, would be social support. We find that having support from other people is one of the most important things to reduce stress. And there are lots of different ways you can be supported emotionally or socially, and support other people socially. You can do it emotionally by showing concern and empathizing with people. You can just be around other people. We have a need to belong as humans in general. That's another adaptive thing about us, but because of that need to belong, we need to be around people, and that helps us reduce stress. You can actually give tangible support to people, like, if somebody is, there's a reason if somebody loses a loved one, people come out of the woodwork to, give them a casserole and bring them food and stuff. It's a tangible thing you can do to help somebody in a time of need. And it might seem inconsequential, but those are real things that, check a lot of these boxes, honestly. Probably all 3 of these first ones, in addition to being a real tangible thing you can do. Obviously, there are more things you can do than just cook for somebody, but it's a good example. Or informational support, if people are stressed because they don't know what to do, or they're not certain what they should be doing. giving advice and helping in that way can be really useful. Social support, as far as coping with big issues in life, like if you, for example, have been diagnosed with a terminal illness, it's of course some time when you would need a lot of support. And studies show that cancer patients do want emotional support and think it is a good thing and helps them, but they don't always get it necessarily. And if you look over time at cancer patients, they tend to adjust better if they have emotional support. And if you, try to actually do something to introduce those types of support, you find that people tend to live longer when they have emotional support. So if you're in a cancer support group, for example, compared to people that aren't, some studies show they tend to live almost a year and a half longer by having that type of emotional support. But this isn't like a slam dunk as far as evidence goes, because some of the studies show that it's not as effective when the support groups are strangers. So, I mean, if the support groups go on for a long time, those people become not strangers. But, some people might feel more comfortable if they got that support from loved ones or people they already know. So it's not totally clear if just any type of support helps. But one study, I'll show you a graph here in a second, of people that were terminally ill that requested a hospice visitor, so somebody to come see them and hang out with them basically as they were preparing to die and just trying to get some kind of connection. So if you just looked at medical records, this wasn't like a randomly assigned study. It was people that made these types of requests or not. So terminally ill patients that requested a volunteer to visit them and got it, requested a visitor and did not get it, or did not request a visitor. If you look at how likely people were to survive over time based on these three conditions, you see a pretty stark difference that people that didn't get the visitor or didn't ask for one tended to be much more likely to die sooner than people that asked for and got that visitor. Pretty striking differences here, actually. And even at the, let's say, the 50-day mark after that request, you see around maybe a 30 or 35 percent chance of surviving at that point if you didn't get a visitor. But if you did, it's about double. It's maybe about 70 0.7 probability of survival at that point. So really enormous effects from a relatively simple measurement here. And obviously, there are other things contributing to these differences. Maybe the people that asked for visitors are somehow different from the people that didn't, but you can counter argue that by saying, well, the people that asked for one and didn't get one have basically the same outcomes as people that didn't ask for one at all. So it does seem that asking and getting it, that getting it is the main difference here. If you also look at just more general things about health, if you look at how much social interaction that people have, how many social ties they have, and you follow people over time, and you use our old, very morbid but very useful indicator of if people survive or not over 9 years, you find that for both men and women, the more social ties you have, as indicated by the white bars, and going to the right, that's fewer social ties. Kind of a confusing graph here. So again, sorry, let me just explain this real quick again. The white bars are the most social connections, then moving on to the right in each of these little clusters, going to the least social connections, and on the y-axis, it's the probability of death, and that's separated by these age groups. So in all of these different groups, you see that people with the most social connections have by far, in some cases, the lowest probability of death. And you see big jumps in the cases of people with the least social connections having a much higher probability of death, particularly at older ages. So having social ties, having these connections is very, very important for people in a very real way, that it can literally be related to life or death. And again, I just want to keep acknowledging that none of these studies are perfect, and certainly this one, if they have more social ties, maybe that means they were more likely to have somebody come into their residence and prevent some sort of, death from a stroke or something, right? So social ties could very literally lead to lower probability of death because people are preventing your death actively. But it's probably some combination of those sorts of things and just the general social support buffering that we see. Oh man, just to drive home how big this relationship is, the relationship between social support and probability of death was very similar to the relationship between smoking and probability of death. So just to give you an idea of how big that effect is, we know that smoking is one of the biggest predictors in behaviors of death, and social ties are not far behind. Social support can also help us, like in particular situations. So in a study where people had to debate against a tough opponent that kind of pulled no punches and was very, critical, if somebody had a friend present that was supporting them versus not, we see this very proximate measure of stress, blood pressure change. If you didn't have a supporter in this study, over time your blood pressure shot up and stayed up. But if you had somebody that was supporting you, then you saw that difference was much smaller. You still had an increase in stress, but it was buffered quite a bit compared to not having a friend present. And again, another example of this, you had people give a 5-minute speech. People always say, what's people's biggest fear? It's not even death, it's public speaking. If you do a similar study to the last one with having to give a 5-minute speech, you take a baseline measure of blood pressure, then have people give the speech where they're getting judged and evaluated, measure their blood pressure again because they've gotten stressed, and then measure it later on once they've had a chance to recover. You have people that have no support versus support. You see still a jump for everybody in terms of how much stress physiologically they're experiencing, but it is a bigger jump for people with no support than people with support, right? And maybe even more importantly, even after they're given time to calm down and recover, I don't remember exactly how long this was. I think it was like at least an hour that people had a time to settle down and calm themselves after that stressful event for them. There's still a significant difference here, that if you had support, you're better off even later on than people that had no support. So all this is just to say, many examples. I know you're probably sick of hearing them at this point, but if we have social support, stress is reduced, and the possibility of death is reduced probably because of that reduction in stress that we get from being connected to another person. So if we have social support, not only is that true, but stress doesn't literally hurt us as much. And this is true in some studies that I have this one up here because it's one of our old pals, Bib Latané, that did the emergency helping research. He did some work with rats too that showed they seem to have fewer pain indicators when they were stressed out if they were around others. Same was true for monkeys in another study, that stress suppressed the immune system of monkeys, but not if they were around and could affiliate with their loved ones. And of course, why would I be talking about this if it weren't true for people? That if you, for example, look at people that have arthritis that's related to stress, if you have people with social support, they have fewer symptoms and they have fewer than depressive symptoms as a result of their arthritis, which can be a very debilitating and overwhelming condition for people. Another example, if you have women that are being shocked while they're getting a brain scan, they tend to have
less of a reaction neurologically in the brain for their pain centers if they're holding somebody's hand. Anybody's hand helps and kind of buffers that pain by from social support, but if it's their husband's hand, then it helps even more. Maybe not the most surprising study in the world that, you know, somebody that you care about helps you more than a stranger, but you know, we don't want to assume things, and it's nice to have evidence that these things are true. And again, kind of similar to some of the studies we talked about earlier with getting the risk of getting a cold, interpersonal conflict, so stress from your kind of social relations, increases the risk of cold. But if you've had an intervention where you have gotten hugs or you've reported getting hugs that day, so getting some kind of make-up social connection in that sense, then that reduces the risk again. So it's just incredible how much social support and connection can influence our health and well-being. Okay, so I know that was kind of a long lesson, but you know, I usually like to take more than one day to get through that stuff, so thanks for your patience. I just have some final notes up here, and then again, thank you very much for all your patience with the weird end of the semester. I hope you're all doing well and you're all safe, and that you know, still had a good experience this semester despite the weirdness, but I really appreciate everybody's hard work and everything. A couple other reminders that you're probably already aware of. Writing assignment 7 is due a week from today if you're listening to this on the first day it's available. So writing assignment 7 due Monday the 4th. Our final exam is on Saturday the 9th. It will be 2 hours this time. That's unless you have accommodations, and then you get longer, of course. But it's only 50 questions, so that should be plenty of time for everybody. I have 2 hours just because I usually schedule it from 10 to 2, but you know, you probably will not need all that time. But just like last time, it's multiple choice. You can take it anytime on that day, because I know not everyone's schedule is the same. There is one last participation activity I put up on Canvas that asks you just to tell me a little bit about your most and least interesting topics you found this semester, and any other feedback you'd like to give me that you didn't give in the course evaluations. On the note of those participation activities, you know, if you haven't noticed them, if you haven't been doing them, please do them. They're still up there. I don't have due dates on them, but you need to do them before the final exam to get credit for those. I'll be calculating grades probably the morning after that final exam is done. So do have these things in if you want them to contribute to your grade. I know they might not be fresh in your mind, but you know, go back and do them. You're going to get points if you just participate. And one last thing, because of all the kind of weirdness with not being able to do Top Hat, we didn't quite get to our 30 points that are allotted in the syllabus for our participation and reading checks. We only got to 26.5, so everybody's just going to get 3.5 points added to their score to get up to that total of 30. So I know I went through this stuff fast, but I just wanted to have a slide with some reminders and make sure I mentioned a few things. But if you have any questions, please let me know. Again, if you want to email or Zoom about anything, just get in touch and we can do that. But good luck on the final. Good luck with everything else going on. Please stay safe. Did I say please stay safe? Please stay safe. And I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks a lot.